Welcome, everyone. I'm Michaela Lafrac. I'm the host of Vermont Edition at Vermont Public. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here tonight as we welcome Jenn White and the 1A team. One more round of applause. So excited. Woo woo. So these days, nearly every conversation that we seem to have on Vermont Edition circles back to one key topic, which is housing, the lack thereof, how expensive it is, how it affects our natural environment when we build more of it. No matter what, we seem to be talking about housing. We are so thrilled to have 1A and Jenn White here tonight to host tonight's important discussion about housing. I used to work at the station in DC where 1A is produced, WAMU, and I got to watch her team in action. The breadth of news that 1A covers in their daily show is absolutely astounding, as is the empathy and the respect that they show each other on their team and their listeners. Jenn White has worked in public radio since 1999. She came to 1A from WBEZ in Chicago, where she held several on-air positions as host of the station's local 2-hour midday show, Reset with Jenn White, and before that, as host of The Morning Shift. She's also a familiar voice from several WBEZ podcasts, including Making Oprah, one of my personal favorites, Making Obama, and 16 Shots. Before WBEZ, White was the local host of All Things Considered at Michigan Radio. She's moderated numerous on-air gubernatorial and mayoral debates. She's a native of Detroit and a graduate of the University of Michigan. We really hope that you enjoy the conversation tonight. And with that, let's give a warm welcome to Jenn White and tonight's panelists.
Everyone. It is so lovely to be here in Vermont. I'm Jenn White, and we're here to talk about housing as part of a special collaboration with Vermont Public. Many people know Vermont as a scenic ski destination or the largest producer of maple syrup in the country. But for a rising share of low and moderate income residents, Vermont is known for something else, being an increasingly unaffordable place to live. The median annual home sale price in Vermont reached $325,000 last year. That's up 5% compared to 2022. Meanwhile, the number of homes sold in Vermont last year was the lowest since 2012, while the housing market was still grappling with the effects of the Great Recession. And that's according to an analysis published last month from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. And it's all happening as lawmakers try to pass laws encouraging more housing development in the state, while facing resistance from Vermont's governor, Republican Phil Scott. Tonight, we're hearing from you and our panelists about how to best solve Vermont's housing crisis and what's at stake for Vermont residents if that doesn't happen. With me on stage is Maura Collins. She's the executive director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. Maura, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Also with us is Carly Berlin. She's a reporter covering housing and infrastructure for Vermont Public and VTDigger. Hi, Carly. And Nancy Owens. She's the president and co-founder of Evernorth. That's a nonprofit organization that finances and develops affordable housing and community development projects for low and moderate income people in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Nancy, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Because you're each coming at this conversation from different perspectives and experiences, I'd love to hear how each of you would describe the housing market in Vermont right now. Maura, I'll come to you first.
I would say not surprising. I would say that having worked and lived in Vermont for over 20 years, that we saw this coming, and we knew that underbuilding in our state would probably lead to this. There have been some surprising factors, I'll say. This interest rate environment of such a fast, sharp increase has really turned up the pressure on folks' ability to afford housing. And yet, I do think that there were some systemic issues that have been happening for a long time that did contribute to this. But I'm pleased to see that we're starting to address those in the legislature, in our communities. And so I do think that things are changing, and we all know that the public discourse and the awareness is so much broader now, I think as evidenced by this event, having people here who want to come out and hear about what's happening with housing.
Carly, what about you? How would you describe the environment?
I think the first word that comes to mind for me is gridlock. Our rental vacancy rates in Vermont, and particularly here in Chittenden County, are really, really, really low, which means that it's very hard to find an available place to rent. And same goes, I'm glad that you cited those statistics about the home buying market too, where the number of home sales is tanking, and that means that people are staying where they are. The high interest rates obviously contribute to that too, but that means that people are stuck and not moving up or able to move homes very easily. And we have some of the highest rates of homelessness in the country as well. And so when you have that really, really tight market, you have more people falling into homelessness as well.
Nancy, how would you describe it?
Yeah, these folks are doing a great job describing it. I think one of the words I use sometimes is, the housing market feels broken. It's not working the way we expect or have seen in the past. And that there's just, there are just not enough homes for the people who want to work here and live here in Vermont. And so the impacts that we're seeing are pretty tremendous. The gridlock, the homelessness, and some of those things are also driven from economic forces outside of our control. And so it's a challenging time.
Maura, as Carly said, we're in Chittenden County. This is where Vermont's largest city, Burlington, is also located. It has a different housing market than the rest of the state. How does it differ?
Being our population center, we know that there's a lot of jobs here, and the median income is higher here. We have the university, we have a key medical center, and so it really is a hub in many ways, and that means that demand for housing is very high here, and so the needs are acute. That being said, I think it's been surprising to people to see the housing shortage permeate even our rural towns and see that we have homeless Vermonters all across the state. But in Chittenden County, we see more renters, but we have more condominiums available, which is a great, more modest housing size. But I was shocked when I looked at the data that last year, the median price of a single-family home was actually about $1,000 less than the median price of a condo. And I always think of condos as smaller, more affordable. We know in Chittenden County we have more condos, and so that's a real opportunity. But to have the median of condos be higher was surprising to me.
Nancy, take us into some of the rural areas in Vermont. And I think when we talk about the housing crisis, it's often discussed through an urban lens. But what are we seeing in rural communities here in the state?
We're seeing a lot of the same issues but there are some differences, as Maura's pointing out. There is the same shortage of housing stock. There's the condition of the housing stock in Vermont across the whole state it's very old, and in our rural communities that's even more the case. There hasn't been as much building overall. So that's a challenge. I think a challenge that rural communities face that's a little bit different than Chittenden County is infrastructure. Water and sewer systems are needed for development, especially when we're talking about multifamily housing, and that's not as prevalent in some of our communities across the state. And there's always a question, we talk a lot about in Vermont, which is scale. So Chittenden County, we're more open to, the communities are more open to larger scale buildings, larger scale developments. And in many other communities in the state, that scale is diminished, and it's harder from a developer's perspective to develop housing at a smaller scale in terms of the number of units, number of homes.
What about the degree of visibility?
Visibility of, well, there's visibility questions around like the question of homelessness. I think that's one of the things in our rural communities. Homelessness has increased across the whole state, and it's not quite as visible in our rural communities as it is in Chittenden County.
As we mentioned at the start, home prices have increased, but the number of home sales have decreased in Vermont for the last several years. Maura, why are we seeing that trend?
I think there's a lot of us who are sitting on 3% interest rates on our homes, and we are not going to be moving anytime soon. I mean, if you think about what a 3% interest rate would be, I mean, you could be looking at a mortgage payment of $1,600 a month. That same home, if that's at a 7% rate, which is about where we are right now, that goes up to $2,500, $2,600 a month. And so we do see people staying in their homes. We also know that when interest rates were so low for so long, and there was a strong economy, and we were all home a lot for COVID, a lot of us added on to our homes, improved our homes, and so the housing stock that was once built to be modest, small, we added on to, we put another story on, maybe there's a bonus room, a porch, a deck, and next thing you know, we have more homes over 2,000 square feet. And so when those do turn over, they're less affordable because they're bigger and have been improved in that way.
There's a lot of variety under the umbrella of housing development, but help us understand the differences between building affordable housing and market rate housing.
Oh yeah, I love this question. So first off, affordable housing in many ways is a misnomer because we start thinking that we're building housing, we're building apartments, and that's true. We're building the apartments, but we're also, when we use public money, we're also revitalizing our downtowns, we're preserving historic structures, we're doing a lot more in that. And sort of if you imagine that iceberg and you look below the waterline, I don't think it shows that we're also addressing homelessness by setting aside units for people. We're providing a platform for services. Sometimes with housing dollars, we're funding services. We're cleaning up dirty soils, and we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions because of the smart growth of where we're putting the housing and the smart transportation connections that we have. But I also think that the role and importance of the market rate housing is critical because I think that for very long, and when I say, for the last 20 years, that we knew if we looked at the different income bands, that housing has not been affordable at the very lowest income band for a very long time. And so I think Nancy and I have seen this with the affordable housing programs we run. But for the last several years, the impact of the housing unaffordability has been reaching up the income band, and now it's not uncommon for me to hear from people earning well into the six figures who cannot find a place to rent, much less own. And so we need all the housing of all the types, of all the price points to address this issue.
We got this message from Rob, who wrote, "We are in a housing crisis here in Vermont. We're in a crisis to keep young people in the state. Developers are building $500,000 houses because that's where the money is, but what we need here in Vermont is $200,000 houses. In my mind, Vermont needs to figure out how to get developers to build small starter homes." And Nancy, we have to note, and as you alluded to, Maura, inflation has touched virtually every corner of the American economy, including housing. How have rising costs changed the types of homes developers choose to take on?
Yeah, I hear what the caller, what the person has said, is it would be nice if we could do that. And the fact is that developers cannot produce a home at that price point, that the home costs more than that to build. And so the math doesn't work. And so that's where developers they're going to meet the market where they're going to be able to make a profit, as any business would do, right? So, and right now, where construction costs have increased over 30% in the past few years. That's had a very strong impact. I think also the interest rates have also affected people's ability to finance the homes and to build the homes and construct the homes. So developers are working within the environment that we have, the economic environment that we have. And what they're looking for, I think, one of the other issues, I think more structurally, beyond a single developer, whether they're an affordable housing developer or market rate developer, is the environment that we're working in to do that, and how all of the things that we are looking for in our communities, the clean soils, the new roadways, the sidewalks that connect our communities, the infrastructure that's needed. In years past, 20 or 30 years ago, those expenses were often borne by the towns themselves, the municipalities. That infrastructure was provided, and when a developer was developing a property, they were responsible for building the building and creating that. But many of those infrastructure costs are now borne by a development itself. And so our rules, our environmental rules have increased. That's great. We have clean water, right? These are good policies and things that we want to see, clean air and clean water and better stormwater systems and connectivity. But those expenses are being borne on new developments. And I like to, sometimes our new developments, whether that's the energy efficiency standards, the construction standards, the stormwater standards, all those things have made great new buildings, and those are great, but they're bearing extra cost.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, the idea was, you go to school, you get a good job, you buy a house, and that house was seen as part of how you measured your success. It was a pathway to wealth building. But when I talk to young people in my life now, they've made the assumption in many cases that purchasing a home is permanently out of reach for them. And Carly, I'm curious here in Vermont, how much of the political discussion is focused around building homes for purchase, and how much of it is focused around building homes for rent, for maybe you're not going to be in there for 30 years, maybe it's a place you're in for 5?
I think that's a great question. I think the political conversation is really centered around just building more, just increasing supply generally to address this deficit that we're facing, this shortage that locks everyone in place. And so I don't think the conversation is necessarily more about homes for sale or homes for rent. I do think there's a divide over, are we building, big A publicly funded affordable housing or market rate housing generally? I think there's, a debate at the State House right now over, the different set of tools in front of lawmakers and the governor's administration to address those things, to just try to increase supply. And a lot of that conversation has revolved around looking at, state, particularly environmental regulations this year around, how can the state get out of the way of just building more and encouraging more growth and development from, the private sector and publicly funded builders as well.
When I hear you, Nancy, and Maura talk about perhaps thinking about the way regulations are providing or creating a barrier to housing, is there a part of you that says we can remove some of those regulations or make it easier for developers, but there's a risk attached to doing that? Nancy?
Yeah, I think to get more housing, we need 3 things. We need some adjustment to our regulations and rules. We need more capital, more money available to create that affordability. And we need some, what I call culture change, so that when we apply those rules, that the housing actually gets built. And so when I think about the rules change, because I want clean water, I want clean air, but we also need housing, right? And so I really try to focus on, can we make a rule where the default at this moment in time is housing? that the rule that's in place is intended to create more housing, not to say it's conditional or it's, if you pass through all these hoops, but that the first priority is that we're going to get some housing and that the rule is set up to make that happen. And we've seen other states and municipalities and counties in other areas make those kinds of changes to open the pathway.
Yeah. Maura, what about for you?
Yeah, Minneapolis stands out to me. I think what Nancy's talking about as an example, I know that NPR had a weekend edition focused on it recently where they made the kind of planning and zoning changes that Vermont has been modeling a lot of our legislation after. And they did things where housing was more the default place, and they increased density and looked to expand what was possible. And they were able to grow their housing stock by 14%. And therefore, the rents only went up by 1% in Minneapolis since 2017, as opposed to the rest of the state that went up by 14%. And so these things really do work, and I think it's proving that there's a lot possible here. And so I'm hoping that we're going to show that Vermont can follow suit, because I think Vermont has a 35-plus year history of not falling into the trap of pitting environment against housing development. We have a long history. Our housing trust fund is not called the Housing Trust Fund. It's a housing and conservation trust fund. And so that is funded by increased prices of land and housing. And so as the market gets hotter, we are investing more in both affordable housing and land conservation. And so these two unlikely bedfellows we've put together and ensured that we are funding both equally to make sure that we are preserving and protecting where we need to, but also driving development into our downtowns densely and appropriately so that we can make sure that the human habitat is as adequately served as all the bear habitats and the other habitats that we have in the state.
I want to turn back to the politics in just a moment, but first we should acknowledge that not everyone is being shut out of the housing market equally. Who's most affected by the shortage of housing here in Vermont, Maura?
Absolutely people with lower incomes. I think that we see that not just in Vermont, but nationally. There are fewer choices there. But I also want to call out that Vermont is one of the whitest states in the nation. 90% of us are white in this state. And so we know that Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC Vermonters, are the fastest growing part of our state, and we are becoming more and more diverse. But we also know that we have a very long history in this nation of not having equal access to that dream that you were talking about earlier. And so in Vermont, the difference between the white homeownership rate, which is above 70%, the Black homeownership rate is 30% in Vermont. That's worse than the national averages. And that's gotten worse since we passed civil rights, fair housing legislation 4 days after Martin Luther King was shot. So we are losing ground in this way. And so something needs to happen differently, because when you talk about who's really not being served, we're talking about the fastest growing segment of our population right now, which is people of color.
I mean, Nancy, as you're working to develop new housing in Vermont, how often do you bump up against 250?
Well, very often that we're working with Act 250, and there's been some tremendous successes with the program and with the states, really creating, as Maura said earlier, we're focused on our housing in our downtowns and in our core development areas. And in those areas, there are ways that municipalities have opted out of Act 250. And that's been a real benefit for affordable housing. So in the terms of its created opportunity for that more dense housing, the multifamily property to be happening in those areas. I think most developers' view of permitting and Act 250 is we want clarity, and we want an answer, and we want the answer as quickly as we can get it. And so one of the issues under conversation is, how these decisions get made, what if there's disagreement, and so forth. And I think the solution is is as quick as we can get it, as firm as we can get it, and that's the best solution. Because time is money in this situation, and Carly's been doing some reporting on a property we're involved in down in Putney, Vermont. That project has been delayed, I think, close to 4 years as a result of actually appeals of a permit process, not an Act 250, but locals. And that impact has been almost $5 million on the project because of it's happened during this time when construction prices have escalated. And that extra cost is 95% of that extra cost is straight in the construction costs. So that's $5 million that's not being spent on other affordable housing that could be being built in Vermont, and that's a delay.
Well, that leads us to this question we got from one of you. You write, small towns throughout the state often block development of any kind through claims of preserving rural character. What is the responsibility of local governments in addressing the state's housing shortage? Nancy and Maura, I think I'd like to hear from both of you on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, zoning is a local issue, and that's not regulated at the state. There's our State Act 250, but zoning is happening locally, and local communities are making changes and making some great changes, and I think our responsibility goes beyond the municipality. It goes right to each of us individually to show up at a zoning hearing. There's a property or a project that's going to happen in your community that will benefit your community with new housing. Show up and speak about it and speak out in favor of it, because I've been to hundreds of these meetings, and it's very rare to see anyone there voicing support for a project. And it makes a big impact when it does happen.
Maura, your thoughts?
Just about every town in Vermont has a cemetery, and that means just about every town in Vermont has a cemetery commission. There are, by contrast, probably fewer than 20 housing commissions locally in Vermont. So we clearly care more about where we're living in the afterlife than where we're living today and trying to get to work, trying to feed our kids, trying to pay for higher ed, and all these things. So I think, as Nancy was saying, where do we want to put our attention? VHFA has been supporting the creation of local housing commissions, and that's how I know there's about 20 of them. We are trying to have resources where people can get local data about where the housing needs, who's living there, what's happening, and then also showing them the policies that work. If I'm in a town that has a lot of retail, and what are the tools I can use to maybe have some taxes or fees from that retail to support the workers who work in that retail, versus if my local needs are about the low rental quality of the housing stock, what do I need to put in place locally to address absentee landlords? Or if I'm in a ski community and I see the number of short-term rentals skyrocketing, what can I do to address that and make sure that there's more permanent housing for residents? And so, as Nancy said, the conversation has to start and end locally, because that's where the rubber hits the road, and that's where the housing needs to be created.
We got this message from, I hope I say your name correctly, Tino Tenda from South Burlington, who says Vermont is known for its progressive and liberal values, yet when it comes to housing, it seems like Vermonters are not living those values. From the legislature to business people to ordinary citizens, everyone you ask says housing is the biggest crisis, yet we are somehow unable and perhaps unwilling to make this an all-hands-on-deck problem. Housing is a human right. My question is, are Vermonters truly living their progressive values if they don't see it right to build more housing? It's interesting in hearing you describe the political tension. It sounds as if it's being framed as sort of an either or. Either we do it this way or we do it this way. But Maura and Nancy, is there a yes and opportunity here?
There needs to be, doesn't there? Dino's right on with that comment, and it is hard to watch sometimes, and yet I do believe that it's coming from good intentions, and I know that some of the conversations at the State House around Act 250 is a very legitimate question around, well, can you prove to me what hasn't been built as a result of this legislation? And the answer is a very unsatisfactory no, because it's hard to prove a negative. It's hard to prove what hasn't happened as a result of developers not wanting to take the risk that Nancy was talking about in terms of timing and what's happening. An earlier question you read spoke to that developers are going to build $500,000 homes because that's where the money is, and versus the $250,000 homes that we really need. And right now in the affordable housing sphere, I'd take a $500,000 home, because the affordable apartments that we're building oftentimes cost even more than that. And so these cost escalations are real, and they are not because of money-grubbing developers who are getting rich off this. It is legitimately the increased cost of land. It's the higher interest rates. It's the cost of materials. It's the labor shortage that we have. And that is the vicious cycle that we're in, which is if it used to take 10 to 12 months to build an apartment building in Vermont, it now is easily taking 14 to 16 months. And if that's the case, that extra 4 to 6 months costs money. And so it just makes the housing that much more expensive when things take longer. And so that lack of predictability can really drive up costs.
Nancy, where do you see the yes and opportunity?
I also agree with Tino's remarks, and the yes and, I think there is a question to ask about, do we want to continue the way things are? We can provide statistics about how things are right now, what those housing costs are, what the rent costs are, how many people are homeless, the lack of supply, and why we need more, what that impact has on employers and so forth. We can say this is what's happening, and we know that more housing is going to make that better. It's going to improve people's lives. It's going to improve outcomes for kids in schools who have housing, all these things. And so what is standing in our way? And I go back to, there's some regulatory relief that needs to happen. There's some more money that needs to flow, because the money has made a difference. We have seen that money from ARPA and these federal funds that we've had access to has made a difference. We're producing more housing. But there is a cultural shift. There is that yes and. There is this acceptance that when Vermont needs 50,000 more homes, or whatever the number is, that it means we aren't going to have 50,000 more single-family homes. That is not what we're going to produce. We're going to produce some of that, some ADUs, some tiny houses, but we need to produce multifamily housing, condominiums, for sale, rental housing. And that is slightly different than the landscape people are used to in some ways. In other ways, travel our towns and our village centers, and there are homes there that are serving this population, these multifamily homes. There's lots of old homes that have been, that are small developments, right? 4 units, 6 units, 10 units. But we need to think about, can we accept having larger buildings and more people? And I don't want to just accept it. I want to see more people here, and I want to see everybody housed.
I will. Speaking of more people in Vermont, Susan is here and has a question about population and its effect on the housing market. Susan, if you can make your way to a microphone. And I also want to invite Angelo to come down as well, who also has a question. While we're waiting for them, Vermont's Housing Finance Agency estimates that the state will, quote, need to develop at least 30,000 homes before the end of this decade to match population growth and normalize the housing market. That's according to the 2023 Vermont Housing Investment Fund annual report. Maura, currently the state is not on track to meet that goal. So what happens to the housing market if development continues at the current pace?
What happens to the housing market is that it gets less affordable, but I think the question is, what happens to Vermonters? I mean, what happens to our economy? Our state treasurer has been very clear that the lack of housing in this state is holding back our economic growth. It has been cited by the rating agencies when they downgraded the state many years ago. They cited the state's stagnant demographics, and that's impacted by the lack of housing. And we hear from employers, and now we have some new programs specifically targeted for housing developers to work with employers, because they're feeling the need to go it alone. Their ability to attract and retain workers is so limited that Vermont is not living its true potential because of not meeting these housing goals and the low vacancy rate of the housing. It means that more and more of our young college graduates are leaving the state. We know that people are choosing to go elsewhere where they can, the wages better match the housing costs. And we're losing a vitality in Vermont that we need to turn around if we're going to have the kind of Vermont that I think so far 650,000 of us think is a wonderful place to call home. There are so many more who want to join us, and there's employers teed up wanting them in their workforce, and we just need to create the environment so that that can happen.
Susan, please go ahead.
I wonder if you could share, or more simply share, some population statistics for Vermont Safe in the last 40 years and some demographic descriptions of that data.
Maura, is that something you do for us?
I have a little cheat sheet in front of me, so I can try my best. I can tell you that I think in terms of households, not population, because I care about housing, so that's my shtick. And so we know that for a long time, we were growing at our households at 1% a year. And then since the pandemic, that has just about doubled. And so there has been a growth. But when the real sharp increase began probably in about 2017, where we started seeing more and more households. I mentioned before, though, that the newer households and newer Vermonters are more likely to be people of color. So we see that white households are growing at that about 1%, but that Black households are growing at 38%, Asian households 36%. So who are Vermonters is looking different now. But also, the household sizes are getting smaller. Now, when I start to sound like a nerd and talking about households, it matters. Household size matters, because when my family of 5 and 3 of those kids someday grow up and move out, they are going to need their own homes. And so that one family home that served us may need 4 homes in the future. Now, some of them may partner up and there may be other things going on, but we know that the household size has shrunk considerably since the 1960s nationwide, but also in Vermont. We have one of the lowest household sizes in the nation at 2.3%, 2.3 people per household. Yet we also know that our homes are too big. Less than 20% of us are in a nuclear family where there's a couple and children living in a household. It's about 17% of Vermonters. Yet, about 60% of our homes are standalone single-family homes with 3 bedrooms or more. So the household configuration we have and the housing stock we have a real mismatch. And you add on to that where Vermont's growing and changing in the future, and we really have a conundrum about how we make sure that the housing in this state meets not only the Vermonters here today, but the Vermonters of the future.
We heard from Daria, who's here tonight, Daria says, I'm curious to know how many former apartments in Chittenden County have been turned into Airbnbs and home and buildings that have been bought for the purpose of short-term rentals. Is anyone overseeing this? And that relates to Virginia's question. Virginia says, tourism is a key industry for all of Vermont, and second home ownership is an increasingly contentious issue here in the state. How do we balance the need for vacation rentals and the boost on local economies with the need for primary residences? So let's start with whether there's any oversight of Airbnbs and other short-term rentals.
Oversight, not in the way I think they're thinking of. We do have data on it, and I can say that since we started seeing the data trends, that the number of short-term rentals is exploding. We're up to about 11,000 homes in Vermont, which is about 4% of our housing stock are short-term rentals. That said, the data going back to the 1940s shows that Vermont has always been either ranked first or second behind Maine of having the largest part of our housing stock be vacation homes. Right now we're at 15% of our homes are vacation homes, and 4% of those are short-term rentals. And what I can't tell you is how much overlap between those two numbers because of the sources of the figures. A lot of those short-term rentals are counted as vacation homes already. We know a lot of ski communities, mountainside condos that have always been vacation homes, and now they're listed on the short-term rental platforms, and that's how you access them. But there also are investor-owned companies buying up units and taking them offline and having them, what would otherwise be a permanent year-round residence, now be a short-term rental. And so a couple years ago, the legislature did allow for towns to regulate short-term rentals. And that was a great move because short-term rentals don't affect all of our towns equally. Burlington locally absolutely is getting hit with this, and so they put in regulations and limits to what can happen. The ski towns, there's about a dozen towns that have a really high proportion of their housing stock as short-term rentals. But after you get past that first 12 towns or so, ski towns plus Burlington, the impact of this really drops off precipitously. So I get that short-term rentals are the newest boogeyman that we all are very worried about. And in several towns, that is a very real threat and has a big impact. But there's 252 towns in the state, and for a lot of them, it's not the impact we think. And I want to challenge our thinking because in some of the towns, our rural Vermont, short-term rentals are actually a great way to drive some tourism into communities that are never going to have a hotel and never should have a hotel. We've reclaimed several old railroad lines, and now they're wonderful multi-use rec paths. And if you want to take a day or two and ride the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail or the Missisquoi Valley Rail Trail, that's great, but you may want to stay in some of the towns along the way. They don't have hotels there, and they probably shouldn't. And so if there was an Airbnb, that may be a good option to drive some tourism into those towns. But when it takes away from our housing stock, and when we don't also in those same towns have enough homes for everyone, that's when you start seeing people have a more suspicious eye about what's going on with these units.
Well, I see we have Shauna with us now, and Shauna actually reached out to us ahead of our arrival here. Shauna's from Fairfield, Vermont, and this was one of several emails we got from Vermonters proposing solutions to a problem that many elderly residents face, which is overhousing. And that's when, as you talked about earlier, Maura, a person is living in a home with more rooms than they need based on the size of their household. For example, a couple who lives alone in a 5-bedroom house. Shauna, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So, as we know, we're an aging population, and here in Vermont, particularly in our rural communities, as you just said, we have a lot of people who are overhoused, older people, who are having trouble maintaining their homes, but who would very much like to continue to live in their homes and in their communities. My solution, my proposed solution, will require coordination, but at the end of the day, it will be a market-based solution, not one that requires continual subsidy. And the solution is to develop a pilot, begin with a pilot, that would reach out to overhoused Vermonters in a particular region of the state, pick your region, but I think it makes sense to begin to focus this regionally. And talk to them about the prospects, figure out how to assess the prospects for changing their single-family home into multiple units. The number of units obviously would depend on the home. But those units would be highly energy efficient. They would provide company and a social milieu for the people who live in those homes. And the people who own the homes now would continue to own them. So the idea is that once a plan is put in place to create multifamily housing of some sort there, then there will be an income stream from that housing. And what we need to do is negotiate with Vermont financiers to say to them, look, rather than requiring owners to have money up front to pay for the construction of these multifamily units, let's let them construct those units. You will finance it. You will be paid back over time from the income stream from those units. Very similar to the on-bill financing notion that innovative utility companies have used to create energy efficiency among their clients. The part of the benefit of this is that the obligation to repay would travel with the unit, so the unit could be sold, the unit could be inherited, but the banks would not lose out. Also, in terms of affordability, we'd be using an underutilized resource, not just the houses themselves, some of which may be in bad enough shape they need to be torn down, but the land. And many of these old houses come with land, so an incentive to people who would then be moving to those properties would be access to that land, shared use of some of that property, which I think is really an exciting thing.
Shauna, thanks for that. I'd love to hear responses from Nancy and Maura.
I think that kind of innovation and that kind of creativity is needed to all the problems that we're going to address today. We need to be doing all the things by all the people. I know that Home Share Vermont is a wonderful program that we have in our state that has done something very similar to that we could talk about. And then I also know that a lot of older Vermonters have thought about downsizing and looking at that. But some of the concerns they have is where would they go? And what you're proposing is that they stay in place. I also think we need to look at our housing stock and see, is it always possible to renovate our homes to have the kind of one-floor living that's so critical for older Vermonters? I know that when my mother was looking at moving into one-story living, it was really hard to find a place where there was a no-step entry, there was a first-floor bedroom and bath, and all that. And so the renovations could be quite complex for that. But I think that we have seen that when you have the kind of hand-holding and I'll say kitchen table consulting that you're talking about, where you're sitting across from someone and talking about their housing situation and what's possible, it works. We've done it with accessory dwelling units. ADUs are used to be called granny flats or things like that, extra units in your home. There's been a program in Vermont where it will sit with homeowners and try to help them figure out how do you turn your home into having an ADU. And but what you need, it's pretty labor intensive to have that kind of conversation over a kitchen table.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say, again, is great. More diversity, more types of housing, all those things are terrific. And ADUs are another example. And the regulations we're looking at changing, where we're upzoning all of our single-family neighborhoods, so that household who might be in an oversized single-family home, it can now become a two-bedroom or a two-unit or a three-unit home. All those supports are falling into place. And so, yeah, let's innovate. And that is a high-touch model, and so, you know, there's a cost to that, and there may be other ways to overcome that. But every kind of housing.
I think it's always good to end conversations like this with questions we should ask ourselves as we leave, because I think you can come away from these big problems, like, oh, we're in a housing crisis, and you can walk away feeling like there's nothing really I can do as an individual, as a member of this community. But I don't want you to leave here feeling that way tonight. So I'd love to hear from each of you as we wrap up, questions we can ask ourselves, and maybe one thing that we can do just as an individual in approaching this from a community level, so that all of Vermonters feel like they not only have stakes in it, but that there's something they can actually do. I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I would hope people can ask themselves, what change am I willing to accept? And is the change that's happening around us now in Vermont one I want to accept, or am I going to do something so that we're shaping the change that we are looking for? Just
And one thing that someone can do today.
Attend a zoning meeting. Attend a zoning meeting.
That's an easy one. Carly, I know you're coming at this as a reporter, but you're also someone who lives in the state. Question maybe we can ask ourselves, something we can do.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the, Vermont progressive values question we got earlier, and I think Vermont is a state that really values the small d democracy, the, civic engagement, showing up at a town meeting and saying your part. And I think that value set also allows for many options for people to say no to more housing, to say no to more density. And I would invite the question of, if you're someone who wants to see more housing get built, is there a zoning meeting you can show up at to say yes when that voice is very rarely in the room?
Maura, I'll give you the last word.
I think the best thing we can do is believe the people we're hearing from, whether it's people with the direct lived experience like we heard from Wyatt, whether it's from a home builder who's telling us that the numbers just don't work, whether it's from the overhoused older Vermonter who's saying that they just can't keep up this home anymore and something needs to change and they need another option in their community. We have to believe the voices that we're hearing and then see what we can do to act on it. So I would then say that the action we can take is to take that next step. You said a zoning board. I would say maybe look at our housingdata.org website to see if there's a housing commission for your community yet. And if there's not, let's get one going. All the tools to do it are there. There are a bunch of them around the state, and I believe all of them have seats open for you. We need more YIMBYs, more people who are willing to not just say theoretically that we need housing somewhere in Vermont, but people who are willing to say, I'm willing to see my neighborhood change and evolve because it's worth it to me that I be able to walk to a restaurant, have my kids walk to school, have the kind of community and neighbors that I know Vermont needs so that we have the wonderful communities that I know we already have and can grow.
I think sometimes we can find ourselves overwhelmed by everything that's happening in this conversation, and that's when it's really good to have that question we can ask ourselves. What's the question we should pose?
What can you do? So often people say, well, I don't have a lot of money. Well, what can you do? Can you write a letter to the editor? What can you do in each situation? I mean, we have a whole bunch of people here tonight, and I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but how many of you have written a letter to the editor about a proposed housing development in your community to say, yes, I want more. I want more traffic because I know that then it's going to get us to a point where we invest in our downtowns. I want more ability to have dense development, and I want more. So what can you do? What can I do? What can all of us do? And call on our elected officials to ask them what they can do. I happen to see our Lieutenant Governor front and center here, and I'm sure there's other elected officials beyond the lights, so let's get it going here.
Well, we will leave the conversation there for now. That's Maura Collins. She's the Executive Director of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. Also with us, Carly Berlin. She's a reporter covering housing and infrastructure for Vermont Public and VTDigger. And Nancy Owens. She's the president and co-founder of Evernorth. That's a nonprofit organization that finances and develops affordable housing and community development projects for low and moderate income people in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Maura, Carly, Nancy, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you. So glad to be here.
And thank you all for your questions and your ideas. This conversation was produced by 1A's Lauren Hamilton, and many thanks to Vermont Public's Amy Zielinski for organizing this event. Bill Lascombe was our sound engineer tonight. Will Anderson did the lighting and projection for the event. Brian Stevenson is the managing director of production. Holt Albee is the senior producer and director. Dave Rice is the maintenance engineer. Kaylee Mumford, Kyle Ambusk, and Riley Cartwright operated the cameras. And 1A comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. Thanks for being here tonight. I'm Jenn White, and we will talk again soon.